Welcome, Dr. Seema Das ji.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome, honorable speakers, ladies. I, Mr. Rudra Narayan Das, on behalf of organizers, extend my heartfelt welcome to all to this international conclave. This Ranjit Guru series of international webinar is an initiative by the Department of History and Political Science, Jawaharlal Nehru College, Cuttack, in a close collaboration with University Research and Development Studies, Odisha. I feel happy to express that we have successfully concluded 96th round of panel discussion today. We have we have um, today we are going to start our 97th, 98th, and 99th lecture respectively. In today's session, I feel extremely honored to introduce our guest speaker, who are none other than Professor Bhagwan Singh Jose, Dr. Seema Das, and Dr. Archana Barmaji. It's a pride privilege to host all of you, sir and ma'am. The broad theme of our international webinar is kept as Initiative Policy Dialogue 2020, COVID-19, and Life Practice Beyond Pandemic. Thank you all. Now, I would like to invite Professor Shubham Das to initiate a brief welcome address. Over to you, Professor Shubham Das.
A warm greeting to everyone, and thanks Rudra sir for giving me the opportunity to go for the brief guest introduction. Our first speaker is an eminent historian, Professor Bhagavan Singh Jose. He is Professor of Contemporary History at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru College, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His specialization is in social and political history of modern India. He is one of the project committee member of the Europe South Asia Maritime Heritage Project. He has also been co-director of the ICSSR project, History of Indian National Congress 1885 to 1947. He is considered to be one India's foremost scholars on communist movement in India. His best known book is Struggle for Hegemony in India, which combines the various perspectives of India's history, the colonial state, the various political parties, the trade unions, and the mobilization of the workforce to form a cohesive whole on the basis of Antonio Gramsci's hegemony concept. Sir will put his insights on why did the nonviolence succeed in India. Our next speaker is Professor Seema Das, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Hindu College, Delhi University. She has 25 years of teaching experience and has published on Gandhi, child labor, education, and political theory as well. She will focus in re-examining Gandhian education system. Last but not the least, our guest speaker is Dr. Archana Verma, Associate Professor, Department of History, Hindu College, University of Delhi. She is a Commonwealth scholar and author of the book The Making of Little Punjab in Canada. Also, she has several publications to her credit at both national and international level. Her research interest includes modern Indian history and the Indian diaspora. Ma'am, your topic as suggested by you is Gandhi and the Roundtable Conference and Appraisal. Now, after this brief introduction, I would like to stop here and invite Professor Bhagavan Jose to please initiate his talk. Sir, please unmute yourself.
I hope I'm visible and my voice is audible to all of you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Now, first of all, I will begin by thanks my friend Professor Vikram Jaina and all the organizers who have organized this webinar under very, very difficult circumstances. I think you are doing a wonderful job, and it is very rare that people sitting in such far-flung areas are able to organize and mobilize scholars from all over the world. Now, before the topic which I gave is why did Gandhian nonviolence succeed in India in that sense? What I mean to say is that if you look at the history of national movements elsewhere, everywhere there was a violence involved, and at many places these movements are led by the communists such as China, Vietnam, Cuba, and many other kind of places where a national movement was very violently fought. While in this country, the non-violence movement was the mainstream movement, while all other smaller streams, they dried up as we moved towards 47. But before I launch on myself to discussing the very nature of this movement, there are three concepts involved in this which I would like to speak about. One is the concept of the state. The second is the concept of strategy. And third is the concept of what Antonio Gramsci, a thinker from Italy, called hegemony. I'm borrowing this word from him in terms of a language, but my understanding of this in this country is very broad and not as limited as was put forward by that thinker. Now, why I bring that thinker into it before I go to the concepts? You see, the history of the 19th and 20th century is the history of revolutions. And when the Russian Revolution was conceived by the Bolsheviks, it was conceived as a world revolution. But by 1923, it became clear that there is no revolution in Europe because there was expected revolution in Germany. So the Russian Revolution got isolated from the concept of the world revolution, and all over the world, thinkers began to ask, why is it there was no violent revolution which was supposed to be followed the Russian Revolution? And people began to think about it. And one of the thinkers who began to raise this question was Antonio Gramsci. He asked this question, and he came to the conclusion that the state, the nature of the state in the European context, where democratic constitutionalism exists and the consent of the people is taken by democratic institutions, there the power is distributed throughout the state, and the strategy which can be useful strategy to undermine the rulers there cannot be of the Russian type. And he called that strategy as war of position against war of maneuver, which he thought was the Russian strategy, military strategy, violent strategy. He called it strategy war of position. But what is the nature of the strategy? There he is silent in that sense. But fascinatingly, there is a one para in his book, Prison Notebooks, where he asked this question: if there is such a thing as war of strategy, as a war of position, who is fighting this war of position anywhere in the world? And then he said, there is only. But he did not elaborate any other things. He thought that war of position can be fought violently. I think he was totally wrong. He did not understand the concept of mass movement and non-violence. It was not the question which can be understood by only studying European history. It has to be a original contribution from another country. Now, this is the reason why I borrowed the concept of hegemony. And as I said, not in the sense in which Gramsci is talking. Now, let me go back to the three concepts I talked about. First was the concept of strategy. What is a strategy? I'd like to read from our book. As all of you know, or at least some of you know, I and my wife, Dr. Shashi Joshi, has written a 3-volume history of the Indian national movement. And that is called Struggle for Hegemony in India. And these 3 volumes are published by Sage in 1992. So this is a very widespread. In detail, what I am discussing here, I think it will be better that you buy those 3 volumes for your library and discuss among yourselves. Now, let me start with the idea. I'm reading from the volume of that books. What is a strategy? Now, this is how we define. The object of an anti-imperial strategy was to spell out broadly how the Indian people were to act in each phase of the long drawn-out struggle to reach the goal of final victory. How the offensive steps were to be coordinated with defensive steps, keeping in view the balance of forces. How nationalist forces were to be mobilized, consolidated, and deployed. And finally, keeping in view the objectively imposed historical necessity, how the entire nation, a nation in the making, was to be united into a historic bloc against imperialism. That was the goal of the strategy. That is what's called strategy in a broad concept in that sense. Now, this brings me to the second concept. And hegemony is a relation not of domination by means of force, but to consent by means of political and ideological leadership. It's not a relationship of power, because all states are based on violence and power. But no ruler can rule any state by pure violence. It has to have the concept of certain groups in society. And this widespread influence and this consent of the people, we call hegemony. It is the organization of consent which is ultimately linked up with either maintaining the existing political power or balance of forces or creation of new balance of forces and new political power. The consent of the groups or ideological political currents is gained through creating, maintaining alliances by means of political and ideological struggles. In fact, what I want to say is that the nature of the British rule in this country was not purely coercive based on power and rule of force. It was a very complicated rule which was there. And it was because of that complicated rule in this country that the British were able to raise armies in this country and use them to defend their rule all over the world. In fact, in the First World War, about 70,000 soldiers were killed and lakhs were wounded. Similarly, in the Second World War, 80,000 soldiers were Indian soldiers, fought for the British, got killed, and fought very honestly and sincerely for them. And this was the kind of loyalty which British were able to draw from our society. It was not a forcible conscription of the people. It was a willing joining the army and people going and fighting for the British rule. Why? Because they were able to draw the consent of the Indian people in that kind of situation. Now, how they were able to construct that state, which were able to draw the consent of the people, is the next theme of my lecture in that sense. Now, my lecture will be mainly focused, because of limitations of time, only on the notion of state and strategy, and why this state and strategy produced what I call only the non-violent movement, as Gandhian movement, as the mainstream movement. In fact, from the very beginning of the 19th century, when the British began to occupy India, there was a discussion about what kind of state we should build in India. That was a very interesting thing. And in fact, in 1838, this is what Macaulay said in the House of Commons. He made a speech about the nature of the coming state which they are going to build in India. And this is what he said: the destinies of our Indian empire are covered with thick darkness. It is difficult to form any conjecture as to the fate reserved for a state which resembles no one in history and which forms by itself a separate class of political phenomena. He said, we are going to build a state in India which does not resemble anyone. It's a very unique kind of state which we are building in India. And then he adds, the laws which regulate its growth and its decay are still unknown to us. What will be the laws? How it will be built? Ultimately, how it end up? We don't know. So this is the kind of discussion which they were carrying on among themselves in that way. So in fact, from the very beginning, there was a debate going on in Britain about how to build and what kind of state is to be built in India. On one side, there were people like Macaulay, Charles Grant, and Trevelyan, who argued that we need to build not a state which is based on force, but a different kind of state. So Macaulay began to codify the laws in this country until 1886. So there was a legal framework which was created. There were courts which were created, and there were, of course, the police department which were created, revenue department was created, so many other kind of departments which were created, and it laid the foundation of a modern kind of state. The basis was brought in. Modern state is based on principles, on methods, on certain legal institutions, and that was what was created. Why did they create it? Because the main premise of Charles Grant and Macaulay was that you can win a victory with the help of arms, but in order to consolidate that victory, you need to reconcile with the people over whom you have won the victory by force. And that is what they summed up by saying it, that military victories are precarious victories. The real victories are over the heads and hearts of the people. Unless the Britain is able to have policies to win over the heads and hearts of the people, their victory will be totally precarious victory in that kind of situation. The logic of Charles Grant and Macaulay was further worked out by a man whose name was Charles Trevelyan. And he said, we can't have a permanent relationship with India, but how can we prolong our rule in India? And that's what he said. He said, for that, we need to ask a different question. How will Indians be able to win our freedom from us? If Indians one day will freedom from us, but how will they win over? He said there are two ways the Indians can do that. One is through the force of arms, that is what he called revolution, and other is through reforms. And that these are the two things. And in India, both kind of forces are available now in 19th century. Those who want to overthrow the British rule, and I'm talking 1838, there are forces in this country, he said, who want to overthrow at one go and want to create a revolution in this country. But there are other forces, he said, very small, but they dimly look forward to create an India on the constitutional assembly basis, a modern kind of democratic India they want to create. These are the forces available to us in that kind of sense. And then he said, then what kind of policy we should follow? He said the only policy, if we want to prolong our relationship with the British, is to encourage forces which want reform on that country. We should carry on successive reforms, and through these successive reforms, associate the Indians with our rule in that sense. And therefore, through that, we should make them feel that they are not slaves, they are partners in the rule in this country, and should be able to win over the heads and hearts of this country in that sense. So that was the debate which was going on. The other side were, of course, as he said, the forces which want to violently overthrow the British rule. And this is what he said in 1838. Now, these forces which he predicted want to overthrow the British rule forcibly, they tried in 1857, and those forces was completely crushed by the British. Now, once again, this debate between those who want to rule India by force and those who wanted to rule India by reconciling through a legal process, this debate became sharp between them. The people who advocated the force, they said, look, Indians now should be crushed completely. They should not allow to have association with the British, and they should treat it with force, and it should be the iron heel of imperialism which should rule India. While on the other side said, no, this kind of rule is not possible in a country which is so vast. And therefore, we need to win over the heads and the heart of the country. And therefore, these people, that is Charles Trevelyan, Macaulay, and others, they ultimately were able to convince the rulers in Britain who were linked up with British Parliament and who were liberals. And they said, yes, we need to change the basis of the state in India. And therefore, from 1857 onwards, the British rule's nature changed. They began to create universities in this country. They began to get colleges in this country, and they gave a freedom for a space where newspapers start coming up. The new intelligentsia was born, and a public space was there through the newspaper to spread nationalism, national debate, of course, within the framework of loyalty to the British, but yet there was a great and a pan-Indian intelligentsia was created. That's how the things began to work. And it was this pan-Indian intelligentsia who in 1885 was responsible for the foundation of the Indian National Congress in that sense. And this was the period when they began to discuss through these newspapers and journals called the notion of modernity in India and a new middle class with new tastes and with new dress and with new outlook of parliamentary democracy was born. Let me sum up now because of limitations of time. So British created in this country, what I say, the most centralized, modern, semi-authoritarian state. We call it a hegemonic state in the formation. Some people call it semi-hegemony state, which means that they created a state that from the end of the 19th century began to introduce the constitutional framework in this country. There were, first of all, municipalities where people began to participate in elections. Then there were legislative assemblies. Then there ultimately legislative council. And by 1937, there were about 14% of the Indians who had the right to vote and who could vote the Indian people, and they could, if they are in majority, they could rule those provinces as it happened in 1937. Of course, this overall rule was under the control of the British in that sense, and yet the parliamentary system began to grow in this country. This is one of the reasons why in India the freedom came in installments, because the British whole idea was, as the people will become fit to rule, we will keep on expanding the legal framework and associate the people, and therefore we'll do it. But that is what commitment was never kept in that sense. That was just a ploy to say that we'll continue to rule India through the method of consent. So the British has worked out a perfect strategy. This is what they thought. They said, we have closed the tap of revolution and we have opened the tap of constitutional reform. And therefore, we can continue to rule. As there will people who become fit to rule, we will keep on closing the revolution path and open the constitutional path. This is one of the reasons that British were opposed from the very beginning, constructed a state which was against the revolution. No revolution can overthrow the state because the state itself is constructed in such a way. So therefore, to sum up, British state, modern state in India has an inbuilt strategy to defend itself. How could it defend? This state invited that let people directly attack us violently, and then we know how to deal with them, drive them underground, crush them, scatter them, and kill them, and slowly weed them out in that sense. And whenever this happens, we go back to the same method. Other is, if people oppose us constitutionally, we give them concessions, and by giving concession, we continue to absorb that movement within the state itself in that sense. But they have never thought that there could be a third type of strategy. That is a strategy which is non-insurrectionary, non-violence oriented on one side, and on the other side, a strategy which is non-constitutional. A new kind of strategy, which is a strategy of non-violent, peaceful mass movement, mass mobilization. And this is where Gandhi comes into the picture. Gandhi invented, of course, with the help of many other things, I can't go into it, a strategy which steered clear the idea of revolution, violent revolution on one side, which the British could crush immediately, or as they did in 1857, or a constitutional framework as the Gokhale type Indian National Congress demanded in that sense. He said, you can't win freedom through the help of constitutional movement only, because the rulers don't listen to constitutional arguments. Power is not based on arguments. Power is based on how people behave in that sense. And then on the other side, he said, but if you resort to violence, then you will be stupid, because that way, by following the violent path of revolution, you will be falling into the trap of the state. Therefore, what we need in this country is a very powerful pan-Indian mass movement, and that is what Gandhi created in this country. And all those people who wanted to make revolution in this country, starting with the Bengali revolutionaries in 1905, followed by the Ghadar revolutionaries in 1914 and 15, followed by Bhagat Singh, followed by the communist movement, and later on today followed by the Naxalites. Nobody can succeed violently against the state, because the state itself wants you to attack itself violently so that it can crush you, drive you underground, and then weed you out in that sense. On the other side, the constitutional movements continued, and it does not make any difference unless the movement of the Gandhian type, which presupposes honesty, which presupposes determination, which presupposes desire to suffer and make sacrifices in that sense, and not shirk back when your life is on stake. Only that kind of strategy was something. Therefore, Gandhi demanded from the Indian people what, let's say, was said in the Bhakti movement by Kabir, Jo ghar jale apna chale hamare saath. Anybody who's willing to stake his life can adopt non-violence, because those who do not want to make a sacrifice should not follow the non-violent, because they cannot follow the non-violent kind of strategy in that sense. And I just want to say a few words how that strategy ultimately succeeded in winning over the whole thing. It's very interesting. Gandhi said that those people who follow the violent path of revolution, this is what he said in 1921. He said, let it be remembered that violence is the keystone of the government's edifice. Since violence is its sheet anchor and its final refuge, it has rendered itself almost immune from violence on our side by having prepared itself to frustrate all violent efforts by the people. We therefore cooperate with the government in the most active manner when we resort to violence. Any violence on our part must be a token of our stupidity, ignorance, and impotent rage. To exercise restraint under the gravest provocation is the true hallmark of a soldiership. And he said, I want those kind of soldiers of nonviolence. In fact, he called nonviolence a war, and he called the Satyagrahis as soldiers of nonviolence in that sense. He said, I'm fighting a war. Remember Gramsci's idea of war opposition he was fighting. But he says, I want a different kind of soldiers. As soldier needs to be trained to fight, they must know their weapons. Therefore, non-violent soldiers also must know their weapons of struggle. That's only they will be able to win over the struggle which is created in that kind of thing. And this is, he said to the Indian people, even the most despotic government cannot stand except for the consent of the governed, which consent is often forcibly procured by the despot and constitutionally procured by those in constitutional country. He says, so long the people will give consent, only then it will be possible for them to succeed. Now, I don't have the time to go into the whole idea how the British thought that what Gandhi was doing the right thing. And he said that the people who are, the Governor General said, the people who are pitted against us, they have chosen the right path. And this path was constantly considered by those who wanted to make revolution in this country. And one of those people who belonged to the Communist Party at that time, his name was G. Adhikari, a very bright man, but he thought Indian state can be overthrown violently, as many people continue to think in this country. But later on, he gave an interview in which he said, I could not then understand the tremendous impact of non-cooperation. And he said, saying no to British power and giving courage to the masses, say no to the power. He says Gandhi taught the Indian people to say no to the power in that sense. He said, later I understood Gandhi's call, a plan to galvanize the masses and rouse the people who had no arms. Gandhi's mass movement was a significant mass expression of the national liberation movement that went to the village level. Stand up and don't cooperate. That was the revolutionary idea of passive resistance. He calls it passive resistance. I think it was the most active resistance which was put forward. Stand up and say no to those whom you don't want you to rule over in that kind of situation. And this can happen only through a mass movement in which thousands and thousands of people participate. It can't be done because the revolution is always made by a minority, a few people who want to go underground, and later on the government picks them up through conspiracy cases. This has happened in that sense, I think. And the British were very clear that Gandhi has brought forces against us. He says his verbiage should not be bothered about non-violence. He said that word means, actually the content of that word is force of the masses. And either we have to crush Gandhi or we must abdicate and hand over power to the Indians. There's no third chance. He said he uses a language which is sweet, which is nice, but the real content of that language is power and force and telling us to get out of this country in that sense. I think I should stop here and should not take more time because there are other very respectable speakers. I should keep space for them. Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful to you for listening to me and showing patience. Thanks.
Thank you, sir, for brief insight, putting a brief insight on the said topic.
Yes, please. I have not understood. What is the question?
Hello, sir.
Hello. Yes, please.
Thank you, sir, for putting a brief insight on the said topic. Now there are few questions in the chat box. I'm just going to read out those questions for you.
Please do read the questions.
Bikram Kesari Jana has asked that two are always considered the significance of reform represents a democracy and a revolution represented communist, more even leftist ideas. How far the dilemma of development always shifting, new paradoxical intervention of prejudice and strategism mindsets approach by the state. Your views on it, sir?
Thank you very much. It's an excellent question. It cannot be answered in a brief moment. I can just little touch upon it. You see, the Gandhian struggle does not mean we remain ourselves limited to the same methods. Within the broad paradigm of non-violent mass movement, you can have so many methods which can be used by mobilizing people, by educating people, and by telling them how prejudice stops people's development in that kind of situation. It is only by educating the people, it's only by arguing them, it's only by convincing them. This is a very painful situation because the act of education is a very, very difficult act. That's what the British said in 1838, that if we put the Indians onto the path of European democracy, he said, and that's what we should do. It will take the minimum 100 years to educate Indians in terms of nation building and nationalism. So therefore, the path of teaching the people, educating the people, and bringing to the idea of nonviolence is not a simple path. It is a very difficult path. People have to sacrifice their lives, have to commit themselves completely in order to follow this path. There is no shortcut to the education of the people, because many a times people, in their eagerness, in their frustrations, they pick up a path which is very dangerous, in which there are a lot of prejudices against each other. That path ultimately leads to ruins, as European history has taught us. But I can't claim that I have answered your question, but the question is very wide, and therefore I am just touching upon it. Please ask the next question.
Yes, sir. Last question.
Yes, please.
The last question asked by Bikram Mahapatra is, what is your opinion on white man's burden principle adopted by the British technically to extend the shadow British rule in India?
It's very interesting. Rulers always say that to the people over whom they rule, they say, we are carrying your burden. Gandhi's point was very simple. He says, please give that burden to us and you get out. This whole language, where the ruler's language must be understood and deconstructed. That's why it's very important to understand the ideologies of the rulers. If you don't understand the ideology, the ruler always say, I am more intelligent than you. My rules are good for you. Let me continue to rule over you because it's very beneficial for you. It is under my rule that you will flourish. Naturally, they will say. White man was saying that burden, but when the colonial people all over the world in Africa, Asia began to struggle against them, then they began to kill to prolong that rule. Why wanted to continue to have a burden? In fact, they should have given that burden to the people and get out of this country in that sense. So please, whenever you study anything, especially there should be a paper on the ideology of the colonial rule, not only in India, but all over the world, especially on Africa. We have missed Africa. There is a need for comparative study of colonialism all over the world. Africa, East Asia, India. What is very limited, and we are prejudiced here. We teach only the Indian national movement. I think that will not be enough. We need to now enter into world history, and history must be understood from the point of view of world history, where Africa should be brought in various countries of Africa should be brought in, and the kind of rule which was established, the colonial rule and violence which was carried on in various parts of the world should also be understood. If today in America there is a struggle going on between the blacks and the whites, this is rooted in colonial history in that kind of situation. And the kind of violence which was inflicted in Africa, where people were taken away from their continent, taken to America, made slaves and sold in markets, and were made to work there. In fact, we have no idea of the ruthlessness and violence of colonialism unless we have comparative studies with Africa and many parts of Asia, which later on became Vietnam and many other countries in that sense. Thank you very much. Any question? If there is, I will be willing to answer.
There is a last question for you.
Okay, please.
Dr. Samuel Lima has asked that how can you correlate hegemony and soft power in British India?
And soft power? I didn't. Please repeat the question.
Yes. How can you correlate hegemony and soft power in British India?
Hegemony is soft power. Soft power is one of the methods of convincing people in hegemony in that sense. They are not counterposed to each other. In fact, it is through soft power that people are able to reach out to other countries. And it's very interesting, when the British came to trade in this country, they were trading firstly economically and with a language which was a very different kind of language. Soft power is one of the elements of building hegemony over people in that sense, where the iron hand is always covered with the glove of soft power in that kind of situation. In fact, behind hegemony, consent, and soft power, there is always a hard power in that sense. And the idea of the thinkers is to lay bare, like the penumbra, layer by layer, what exists inside and what is the true content of that ideology, and not be misled by the mere language of soft power in that kind of thing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for responding all our questions. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Seema Das to initiate our talk.
Can I leave?
Yes, sir, please, if you can. Yes, sir, if you can. Sir, please unmute yourself. We could not hear you. Yes, sir.
I will come back and listen to Professor Archana Verma as well as Professor Seema Das. It's only for a few minutes. I seek your forgiveness. Thank you very much.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Good morning.
Please unmute your phone.
Okay, ma'am, please.
Okay, yeah. Can I speak now?
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Yeah, good morning to all of you. And a very thank you to the organizers who have given me this chance to speak on Gandhi. Basically, I'm going to speak on Gandhian ideas on education, and would try to examine his ideas of education and try to bring out the relevance of his ideas of education in the context of new education policy, and how and what aspect of Gandhian scheme of education has been carried over in new education policy that I would try to bring out. What I want to today speak on Gandhian ideas of education or Gandhian scheme of education is that, first of all, I would the context in which Gandhi had brought about his scheme, and then I will try to speak on the various features of his scheme of education, which is popularly known as Vardhai scheme of education. And I would try to examine and bring out the criticism and what I think that is some kind of a shortcoming or the controversy which it had created when Gandhi had started writing on his view on education. He had started. Also, there was a very famous conference which is known as Vardha Conference, which in fact brings about his famous Vardha scheme of education. And then also I'll try to understand new education policy from a Gandhian perspective on education, and how new education policy and to what extent new education policy has incorporated Gandhian ideas on education. So as far as the education is concerned, I see education in two ways, like education as the function of education is that firstly, what it does is that it makes us adaptable to the social structure in which we are living in. And so it has a conformist kind of a role, that it makes us think and try to accept the social structure or the environment in which we are living in. And the second very important role of education is that it is an agent of change. Like, it brings about change. It also transforms the whole system. It brings out the idea of transformation of the whole system. And in that process, it also, in fact, transforms the whole personality. So having said that, now coming to the Gandhian idea on education. Now, Gandhi was writing in Harijan and other journals in around 1937, and I'm basing my perspectives of in fact, this paper on his writing in Harijans around 1937, and also, in fact, the conference proceedings and the committees which were formed to implement or to look into the various aspects of the proposals which Gandhi, in fact, was talking about. Now, Gandhi, and first of all, from Dr. Professor Bhagwan Josh, like, education is a very important component of ideology. Rather, it is a part of the ideological apparatus of state. So education had a very important role. And when it was laid by the Britishers through the whole system and structure of education, which was laid by the Woods Dispatch of 1854, and then and that was all to cater the needs of the British colonial state in India. Now, with the growing nationalistic feeling, and the nationalist education was very important. Gandhi understood the importance of education and the role of education in transforming individual who would think on a nationalistic perspective, not being just a mere like administrative at the lower rung of the British administration. Rather, what was needed or need of the time was that to have some kind of a people who would be a citizen with a nationalistic feeling, who would think about India, who would think about, who would be truly developed, who would know about their rights, who would know about their duties, and would contribute as a citizen towards furtherance of peace and furtherance of non-violence, what Gandhi was the basis of the Gandhian philosophy. Now, Gandhi says that the British, many other things he talks about, but one of the defects he points out about the British system of education was that he says that it was truly wasteful and harmful. Why it was wasteful and harmful? Because according to him, most of the pupils or students at the end of their college education and school education do not even know what they would do after completing their education. So what in fact emerges is a huge breed of unemployed people. And secondly, it also kills the creative genius of students, both boys and girls, during their learning process. Then, therefore, what in fact Gandhi talks about or thinks about what is true education according to Gandhi. Gandhi says that, and to quote him, he wrote in Harijan on July 31st, 1937, that he says that by education, I mean an all-round drawing out of the best in child and men, body, mind, and spirit, He says that literacy is not the end of education, nor even the beginning. It is only one of the means whereby man and women may be educated. Literacy in itself is no education, according to him. Literacy is only symbolic representation of knowledge. And what is true education? He says that through, and how the true education can be inculcated. He says that it is through the active learning, and active learning can be done through observation, experience, then service, experiments, all these, through all these things, and active learning can be done, which would ultimately lead to the development of spiritual and rational faculties of students, and also would lead to the development of their physical self. So the true education is basically a kind of would lead to the all-rounded development of student. Now, how this true education can be achieved? For that, he brings out his Waldheim scheme of education, and the Waldheim scheme of education basically revolves around 5 fundamental features, and one by one, I would like to speak on these features. First and foremost, he talks about is that the education should be craft-centered. So the education should be through the learning of craft, and what we in present context we understand by vocational studies, vocation. But it's a very different thing. The vocational, there is a difference between what Gandhi is talking about, craft-centered education, and what we find incorporated in new education policy as a kind of learning of craft. What Gandhi in fact says is that that the principle of intellectual training in and through a craft is the most fundamental part of learning. And before I come to why he says and why he has so much of faith in craft-centered learning, I also, in fact, would like to draw upon Gandhian understanding of childhood, which is quite different from those of from Western universal model of childhood, because Gandhi sees a child not as a kind of object of learning, but unlike Western concept of childhood, rather Gandhi, in fact, perceived child as a social subject. Who is capable of being one's own agent of development if right environment is provided. So Gandhi says, and for this, Gandhi says that a child should develop the soul force, and this can be developed only through proper training, which is based on coordination of body and mind. And so therefore, Gandhi on this notion of childhood, he makes his scheme of education and introduces learning of basic craft, which should be the nucleus of all the other instruction provided in the school. And how it is going to be a nucleus. Gandhi, first of all, before saying that, Gandhi says that it should not be, craft learning should not be some kind of a auxiliary activity, but rather it should be the center of the learning thing. So he writes in Harijan, sorry, he says that I want to teach the village children only the handicraft. I want to teach through handicraft all the subjects like history, geography, mathematics, science, language, painting, and music. So at the center of learning is learning a craft, and through handicraft or craft, one learns rest of the other disciplines, other subjects. And therefore Gandhi says that it is not a supplementary course to intellectual, but rather it is the basis or nucleus on which the learning process can be done. So it has brought about a revolution in pedagogy. The structure of education is also changed in his scheme of education, but the most revolutionary and transformative change which Gandhi talks about is the pedagogical change, like how to make child learn, how to make him engaged in learning. That he says through experiential, that is through learning of craft, one one learns rest of the things, and that should be, therefore craft should be the basic and the central component of curriculum. Now, just to clarify this, because it's very important to make it distinct from what we know today of vocational skills, learning of vocational skills, and what Gandhi, in fact, is talking about. Now, in new educational policy, we find mentions of handicrafts, and talks about that carpentry and other spinning and other things should be taught as a skill in a school. And also, there is a lot of emphasis on skill-based education in new education policy. But it is something different from what Gandhi, in fact, had visualized. For Gandhi, basic handicraft is at the center, and through handicraft learning, we learn the rest of the things. But in new education policy, what we find is that there is handicraft or craft learning is seen as a supplementary learning, supplementary course, not the basis of learning. Now, I would like to clarify, I would like to, in fact, throw more light on this Gandhi's method of learning. That is, he says, two examples I'm going to quote here. He says that Gandhi said that if carpenter teaches me carpentry, I shall learn mechanically the skill to use various tools, but that will hardly develop my intellect. But if some same thing is taught by one with scientific training in carpentry, he will stimulate the intellect too. For the expert would tell me mathematics, difference between various types of timbers, their sources, so geography pitches in, a little knowledge about agriculture, and also the history of wood, etc. So in that way, the other things can be learned. Another example he was very fond of was that giving of takli. I think that everybody here understands what takli is. Takli, in fact, is a small an instrument whereby in school you learn. Unlike we were also, in fact, given in school way back many years ago. And that takli is used for weaving from out of cotton. So weaving was was one of the favorite craft for Gandhi. So he says, giving example of this takli, he says that spinning through takli in schools is what one gets is that it also, in fact, it imparts or knowledge of various varieties of cotton. And in that sense, we also understand different soils in different parts of provinces of India. So geography is also taken care of. The textile industry is also taken care of. And how the textile industry was destroyed by the Britishers, that will also be taught by keeping this takli weaving at the center. Then the political reasons also comes in. And knowledge of arithmetic also can be imparted with the use of takli. So that craft making, what Gandhi, in fact, is basically talking about is that craft should be at the center of learning. It should be the major component of the pedagogy in the school. So therefore, he also, in fact, gives a lot of other details, which I think that I don't have time, because I have to speak a lot about other things about Gandhian scheme. But what he revolutionized the pedagogical aspect of craft education of his school education by what Zakir Hussain then said, that what he did was that he introduced productive manual work, and secondly, he stimulated intellectual work through the craft, and thirdly, he correlated various subjects with the basic craft. So that is what Gandhi was talking about as far as the method of learning in schools are concerned. That will keep children occupied and engaged also, because Gandhi, one of the merits Gandhi says is that it will psychologically relieve child from tyranny of purely academic and theoretical instruction. So this and there are many other, in fact, things, many other merits also with this kind of learning, which Gandhi says is that, for example, it will also breaks down barriers of prejudice between manual and intellectual worker and cultivate some sense of dignity of labor among the students. And this is something which is of it's very significant that a child would learn to become a kind of ethical and moral individual. So, and this is also, Gandhi also says that this is something not new, like project-based method, which was taught in the schools of America and England and also in Russia, it takes into account what Gandhi was talking about, learning through doing, that is learning through craft. So this is the first feature of Wardha School was craft-centered process of education. The second feature was self-supporting nature of education. Self-supporting nature of education has become quite controversial, at least in one sense. What Gandhi talks about self-supporting scheme of education, he talks in terms of two types of meanings, twofold meaning he gives to this self-supporting nature of a scheme. The first is that education should help one to become self-supporting in later life. Right? So after education, so learning of these crafts, you can specialize later on in college education, and then you become a kind of employable. So the problem unemployment is taken care of by this once the student pass out from such kind of learning from the school. So Gandhi says that the state takes charge of the child at the age of 7 and returns him or her to the family as an earning unit. This is so far so good, but the second meaning of self-supporting, what Gandhi in fact chalks out, had then also attracted a lot of criticism, and today also it is something which goes against the public funding education system, which I think the state should at least have at least the one of the basic, in fact, function of state is that it should fund the education in all stages. What Gandhi, but Wardha system, the self-supporting thing about in Wardha system is that it says that the expenses of teachers' remuneration would be met by the productive work which child does in the school through the craft. So Gandhi says that if the craft is taught efficiently and thoroughly, then it should enable the school to pay towards the cost of teaching staff. So to him, good education system will cover the major portion of schools' running cost, but the student, in fact, what a student does, his product should be sold to the market, and he gives some kind of a function, a responsibility to the state, that the state should buy these products, even if it is at a higher price, but that would support the school system by paying the salaries of the teachers. What state should do? State, according to Gandhi, should just spend on land, equipments, buildings, etc., and should coordinate and monitor the various school systems, but the school should be self-sufficient as far as the self-financing mode, which we call it today. And there is there are certain things which are very vague about it, that the how state would be able to, in what way state would take it up, and how feasible, in fact, it was that the state would buy all the products of the students. So that had created a lot of controversy then. And one very important thing about this is that this also privatization of primary education, which though we find that at least in the school education, privatization has happened, but the state should not, in fact, should be absolved from its duty of imparting education free of cost. But Gandhi says that Gandhi perhaps was taking was very much worried about that how India, a poor country like India, would be able to invest so much of money in school education. He was writing in 1937, and 1937 when 6 of the provinces had Congress government, and he was really very much hopeful about it. But still, in fact, he was not giving a lot of burden. He was not, in fact, in favor of giving burden to the state to carry out public funded education. Another thing what Gandhi, in fact, was interested in was that he thought that such kind of self-supporting school system would enable state to introduce compulsory free education, which the nationalists, in fact, were asking the British government to introduce. Gopal Krishna Gokhale was in the early 20th century had asked for compulsory education to be introduced but it was rejected by the Britishers. Another very important thing about this kind of self-supporting this school system is a very important danger, or very obvious danger of the working of this scheme, is that in such situation, economic aspect will be stressed out at the sacrifice of the cultural and educational objectives of this education system. What will happen is that teachers would devote most of their energy and attention to extracting the maximum amount of labor from the children while neglecting their intellectual, social, and moral possibilities or implications while through craft learning. So in that sense, we can say that this would revive, or this would somehow encourage child labor in disguised form. This is a major problem with such kind of self-supporting and craft and centered learning in Wardha School of Gandhian education. Now, apart from that, Gandhi, apart from these two features, the next feature of Wardha scheme is 7 years of free and compulsory education. Gandhi talks about. Now, free and compulsory education, now it is very important. It's very important aspect of new education policy. Rather, we all know that RTE, Right to Education Act 2009 had introduced compulsory education, primary education in India, and new education policy has added or more years, like now it's from 3 years onwards, 3 to 14 years, the compulsory, it talks about the introduction of compulsory education. So the Act talks about this compulsory education in India from 7 to 14 years. Gandhi was talking way back in 1937 about this 7 years of compulsory education. Previously, it was 5 years, but Gandhi, in fact, was talking about that there should be compulsory education from 7 to 14 years. It ran through both the primary and secondary education. Now, how it was free? It was not. It was free. Why it was called free is compulsory education. It was free for the parents because parents did not have to pay any fees or do not have to pay any fees, but from children's point of view, they had to pay through their labor. They had to pay the tuition fee through their productive manual labor, and other things would be taken care of by the state. So this is how the 7-year compulsory education can be introduced according to Gandhi. Now, another very important thing which Gandhi was integral to Gandhi's idea of education, or the scheme of education, which again has been is a very relevant thing because it has been incorporated in new education policy. It again has thrown a lot of controversy around it, and that is the emphasis on Indian languages, especially the mother tongue. So mother tongue, Gandhi was very much clear about that mother tongue should be the medium of instruction, and it should occupy the first place among the languages. And the second language could be Hindustani language. And he has pointed out many good things about Hindustani language. One thing was that it could be used as a lingua franca. And secondly, it could be seen as a kind of a combination of both the Muslims and Hindus' heritage of language. So Hindustani, consisting of both Hindi and Urdu, would also in fact symbolize some kind of a communal harmony. But on mother tongue, Gandhi is very much clear that it is the foundation of all education, because if you are imparted instruction through mother tongue, then you also develop precision of thought and clarity of ideas from the very beginning. And not only that, it also opens students to their culture, their heritage, the cultural heritage, and they make them exposed to the ideas of the people, the aspirations. So basically, the whole the culture can be, the values, cultural values can be imbibed through through the instruction in mother tongue. And not to say that mother tongue it makes child easier to understand if the education is imparted in mother tongue. Now I know that it is quite in a globalized world. If we There is a lot of scope, or there is a lot of, in fact, danger if we leave English as a lingua franca, or English, we in fact put a global language like English on the margin, and try to and give a lot of primacy to mother tongue as a medium of instruction. There is a lot of pros and cons on this, because education, in fact, adapts itself to the changing circumstances. And in a globalized world, maybe there may be some other necessities or the requirements which has to be met, and one has to. But still, a new education policy gives emphasis on mother tongue to be a medium of instruction, at least in the class, I think it is 8. Another thing, the last feature of Vardha's scheme of education is his Gandhi's emphasis on the cult of non-violence, or ahimsa, which is his plan of education, in fact, is full of this cardinal creed of non-violence. Why he says the non-violence, or he bases this non-violence as a kind of a he tries to build the whole education around this cult of non-violence. Now, some light could be thrown in the writing, in Gandhi's own writing, and also writing of Mahadev Desai, who said that the idea of self-supporting education cannot be divorced from the ideological background of non-violence. Now, and one of the reasons why he's talking about self-supporting education is that he believes that education is funded by the exploitation of the people, or the money derived from exploitation of the people would not produce an ideal citizen in India who would fight for India's independence and who would be imbued with the culture and of nationalism. Now, so therefore, Gandhi is talking about, he says that, to quote him, that if we want to eliminate communal strife and international strife, we must start with the foundation pure and strong, by rearing our younger generation on the education. So, and Europe is an example where its program is based on violence. America and Europe has reduced the art of exploitation to a science, and India has no other alternative but to base its plan of education on non-violence. So cult of non-violence becomes very important and integral part of Vardha's scheme of education. So these are the basic features of Gandhian education system, which Vardha's education system. A few while examining this Gandhian system of education, few things, there are so many other things, drawbacks which comes to our mind, but a few aspects I would like to here highlight. Apart from the theory of self-supporting education, there is a kind of and also apart from looking at the schools as some kind of it was also seen then that a school was seen as some kind of a transformation into a factory. So Gandhi, the accusation was that Gandhi had introduced labor and slavery in the school, and turned the school into factories. That is what this was the criticism then. But Gandhi counters this, and it says that work does not make anyone a slave, and he believed in the dignity of labor. And he also said that just as we do not become slaves at our home when we work for the instruction of the parents, so it is our perception that how we see it. So in bad hands, everything, the good things also can become bad, but in good hands, and if your intention is good, then the result would also be good. And thus he rejects that the factory his scheme of education would produce factory labor. His craft-oriented education had also been criticized on various points. One was that culture is neglected. Only carpenters or weavers, but we do not only want them, but we also want really cultured men and women. Now, another point which is a drawback of this kind of education would be that there are a lot of emphasis on craft, and specialization in the premature age would restrict the choice of career option for the students. So there are many other things which Gandhi talks about. He also talks about the conscription of the teachers, just like in Italy. He gives example that in Italy there used to be conscription of teachers, well-trained teachers. All. But one thing which I think is where Gandhi scheme of education is lagging behind, or has been myopic, is that his scheme of education has not been gender neutral. From the gender perspective, if we see, then Gandhian scheme of education is not gender neutral. The syllabus he talks about in the Vardha scheme, he says that from class 4th and 5th syllabus in science should be modified to include domestic science for girls. And in grade 6th and 7th, girls would be allowed to take an advanced course in domestic science in place of basic craft. So this kind of discrimination we find in Gandhi. But I think that Gandhi was, in many ways, and especially on the gender question, Gandhi's idea was quite conservative. It was not transformative. It was quite conservative, and he was basically the scheme. Many of the parts of this scheme was kind of has a conformist element, as I would like to say. Now, in the end, I would like to say that what are the features which are there incorporated in the new education policy. The features which are new education policy in 2020, first and foremost, it talks about the compulsory primary education. Though compulsory primary education has been is implemented in India from 2010, and right of compulsory education, right, RTE, was promulgated in 2009 only. But what a new education policy does is that it tries to prepone, and it tries to add more years to the compulsory education by incorporating ECCE also into this. Secondly, the mother tongue as a medium of instruction. Then the third is new education policy talks about, very quickly because I think I'm short of time. So it talks about experiential method of learning, but it gives a lot of emphasis on of learning of craft. But these crafts are very different from what Gandhi would speak of. Or what Gandhian scheme of education would incorporate, because craft is not at the basis of the learning. Maybe that is, in a globalized world, the necessities or need of the time is different. So these things are incorporated in new education policy. But it is different from what Gandhi was saying. It is not learning. In some way, it is learning by doing. But for Gandhi, the craft was the basis of the center of the learning process in the school. Now, vocational new education policy, the teachers training, in fact, is it acquires a very prominent place in new education policy. There is total restructure of B.Ed training institutions and all, and that is because a new kind of teachers with new kind of orientation is needed. Teachers' orientation is very important in imparting education and in checking the dropout rates in colleges, in schools in interior part of the India. So now I will end by saying this, that at least Gandhi's scheme of education is relevant in these aspects, and at least Gandhi's scheme of education has transformed and had given us some kind of a alternative way of learning in the school system, which would make a child a kind of more engaged, and this kind of pedagogical change enables child to grow into a well-rounded personality, a developed and well-rounded personality, and at least with some kind of moral and ethical pinnings, who would have some kind of faith in the dignity of labor. That Gandhi, in fact, what Gandhi would like to have, the ideal citizens, some kind of ideal citizenship. To certain extent, this could be achieved through this scheme of this thing. So it has, in a way of pedagogical transformation, a pedagogical change, the contribution of pedagogical structure, pedagogical component, which Gandhi's Vardha scheme of education provides, is a very good alternative one can, in fact, incorporate in our new education policy while implementing it. Thank you.
Thanks, ma'am. You have, in a brief period of time, you have put an insight on how Gandhi emphasized the vocational education, and also the craft should be the central base of education system that you have said, according to Gandhi. And you have nicely compared it with the new education policy today. You have rightly said that the craft is a supplementary input in the new education policy, but it is not the central base of education like the Gandhian system of education that you have nicely suggested. But before I'm going to discuss the question and answer session, there is one question from my side, that how you visualize Gandhian system of education is much more relevant today when we are rapidly moving towards an artificial intelligence world and automation. What the Professor Yuval Noah Harari explained in his book, The 21st Lessons for the 21st Century, in which he chalked out the technological disruption in terms of advancement of artificial intelligence and machine learning, automation, which will create a challenge to the future job market if we see by 2050. Then I am thinking it is much more suspicious that how the Gandhi system of education, if you will implement today, will much more relevance. So how you visualize it?
Yes, actually, while I was talking, let me make it very clear that I was trying to highlight on the various aspects of Gandhian education scheme of education. I was not trying to justify it thoroughly. I have a problem. I have a lot of problem with Gandhian scheme. But let me just tell you one thing, that the education system is basically it is very much context specific. Gandhi did not visualize this artificial intelligence and its significance in learning. See, and I've also, in fact, I think that I've touched that globalization has made it totally change. So therefore, no education policy can thoroughly, in totality, adopt Gandhian scheme of education. But Gandhi, the craft can be he's talking about the list of craft was very much inclusive. So in a given chance, for example, nowadays what we see is that coding has become a kind of a skill. Coding is seen as a craft. So learning of coding and all. So that could be taken up as, for example, if artificial learning of artificial intelligence, though yes, of course, maybe in future it would, but Gandhi was talking about labor intensive crafts and all. The point was that Gandhi, by keeping these things at the center, people should learn other things also. For example, if artificial intelligence, learning of artificial intelligence is at the center, so then all other dimensions, geography, economics, polity, history, etc., could be learned around keeping that thing at the center. This is what Gandhian model was talking about. I think, but Gandhi, in fact, did not anticipate in this sense. So Gandhian scheme of education is not relevant in totality. But the principle on which Gandhian education system was built up has a lot of relevance for us. And so it was incorporated in new educational policy also. It gives due emphasis to AI and other things. And employment situation, I think, is a very complex situation nowadays. It's not only depends upon the what kind of education you take and what will happen in future. Let's see it. What will happen? The employment scenario is very dismal at this, and not only technological advancement is not the only reason which is leading to this kind of situation. There are so many other things also. I think I have answered your question.
Yes, ma'am. There is another question asked by Vikram Mahapatra. Education now in India is in the hands of corporate world. How to implement new education policy which is out of reach of rural India? How to fulfill the dream of Gandhi? Over to you, ma'am.
Of course, that is what corporate. Of course, when Gandhi was talking about self-supporting education, and he was linking his education to market. The state had a very little role in Gandhi's scheme of education. The state had a very little role in maintaining the maintenance of the school system. School system, only the land and equipment state would take care of. Rest of the things, in fact, the child would produce, and his products would be sold in the market, and the market and thus the school would generate money for maintenance and the costs of running the school. That's what Gandhi was talking about, and that is what I'm quite critical, because I am a supporter of public funded school system. Now then, Gandhi, and also higher education, I have not touched upon because paucity of time. The higher education he was talking about, and higher education he integrated with the secondary and the school education. Both were, there was a close coordination between the higher education and the school education in Gandhian scheme of education. And most of the higher education he left in the hands of the private parties, Tatas and others. Of course, the motive of the private houses in those days was quite different from what we find now. So, we are in fact growing towards the privatization, and that's very really that's something which on a large scale, which takes away the essence of the learning. But Gandhi was supporting this self-supporting thing. That is the major thing which I was criticizing Gandhian scheme of education, was that self-supporting education system Gandhi was saying. So he was linking it to the market. So when we say are taking over, then we cannot in fact absolve Gandhi of saying that Gandhi was doing something against them. Gandhi was very much pro these private houses taking over the education. So totally the higher education, he said that higher education should be taken up by the industrialists, and it should be should be in line with the requirements of the states, what the state needs, what the industry needs. It should be so. In that way, the subjects like political science or history would have no meaning, because it doesn't have that kind of requirement for state in a specific sense.
Yes, ma'am. The last question for you is from SK Imran. That was said that he supported the views of Gandhi's education system, but still there is a huge problem in the mindset of the people of our nation, that they discriminate people on the basis of caste. and still education for all criterion in India is incomplete. So how Gandhi will respond to these questions in your ideas?
See, again, that is a very valid question. Why it is a very valid question? Because I know I have done a pilot project in Bihar on school education, and I have seen that how caste is responsible, not only caste, even patriarchy is responsible for dropping out of the children. People do not go to the schools because the students do not go to, the small children do not go to the school because the teachers, they say that of the lower caste that आप लोग पढ़ोगे तो काम कौन करेगा. This type of statement we see, and caste is really one of the obstacle, and it is one of the teachers, in fact, the mindset which is very much caste oriented, and the patriarchy similarly. I'm not going to give you example on that because of the shortage of time, I believe. But this caste and patriarchy are the two very important obstacles, or very significant obstacles in as far as the universalization of education in India is concerned. So one thing is at the theoretical level, another thing is at the ground reality level, at the grassroots level. Caste and patriarchy, I believe, I agree that it plays it plays a role of hindrance for universalization of education. But Gandhi, in fact, very idealist. Gandhi's approach was quite idealist. So his whole idea of non-violence and adoption of language, etc., it all, in fact, believed in a communal kind of harmony and caste. But Gandhian scheme of education did not touch upon that. I did not touch upon this criticism of Gandhian school of education. But the Gandhian school of education did not, in fact, take into consideration the caste factor or the gender factor as far as the universalization of education is concerned. That is the drawback. That's one of the drawback of criticism of Gandhian scheme of education. But then if a product of Gandhian school of education would not believe in casteism, would not believe in untouchability, would not believe. So once that kind of mindset is achieved, or training of teachers, maybe through training of teachers, making them more people oriented, humane in their orientation, in their attitudes, and if a product of Gandhian school of education is humane in orientation and has respect for all, then in that sense, maybe over the years, it will not, changes would happen. Changes in such kind of scenario would take place. So this is how I can see that the Gandhian whole idea of education can bring about change. Of course, it is not a kind of a revolutionary change in the sense that it will happen at one go, but it would take it would take generations maybe. But things are changing. I think that things are also changing from 1937 till 2000, and now today in 2020. Changes are happening even in the caste scenario and even in the gender scenario, or various other reasons, because we all of us are aware of. And gradually, caste will not be an obstacle for universalization of education, I believe. I think I've answered that.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am, for responding all our questions. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Archana Burma to initiate her talk. Over to Dr. Archana, ma'am.
Ma'am, please unmute yourself. Professor Burma, please unmute yourself.
So am I audible now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I must appreciate both Professor Bhagwan Josh's paper and Dr. Seema Das's paper. And I would like to respond to Seema Das first, how I will link my presentation on Gandhi and the Roundtable Conferences and appraisal to both the speakers' presentations today. So my study would throw light on how Gandhi understood the ruler's language of political education and how he deconstructed it. And when Professor Josh spoke, he spoke about the fact that the colonials had two alternatives: either to crush Gandhi or to abdicate power. And as history has shown that the Britishers could not crush Gandhi, they had to abdicate. So I want to first thank Dr. Bikram and his team for giving me this opportunity to be present today. And I want to make a few things clear about my presentation before I come to the specifics. And it is that this topic, Gandhi and the Roundtable Conferences is not a traditionally popular subject among historians in terms of research input, because very little work is available on the actual dynamics of the Roundtable Conferences. But at the same time, this subject has popular appeal in terms of Gandhi and Ambedkar, more specifically in terms of Gandhi-Ambedkar controversy at the Roundtable Conferences. Many scholars have given their interpretations on this, and I would like to name two prominent scholars, Gail Omved and Christophe Jefferlaw. Some of you must have heard about these two scholars. They are both renowned Ambedkarite scholars, and Gail Omved has given the interpretation that because the battle lines were drawn between Gandhi and Ambedkar in the Roundtable Conferences, Gandhi had sidelined Ambedkar, being a Congress elite, representing the elite Congress in his person. So she blames Gandhi for the divergence that took place between Ambedkar and Gandhi. On the other hand, Christophe Jefferlaw, who's also an Ambedkarite scholar, he supports Ambedkar's demand for, quote unquote, separate electorates, as he believes, this author believes that the separate electorates would have endowed untouchables, and I will be using this term synonymously with the depressed classes, as the Britishers referred to the untouchables as depressed classes at the time, but both Ambedkar and Gandhi used the term untouchables. So Jefferlaw ki jo interpretation hai, he has put forward the interpretation that separate electorates would have endowed the untouchables with political power, and that in the course of time he predicts that that could have helped eradication of untouchability. I would quickly refer to Gandhi's reflections on this because I will be talking more about Gandhi at the Roundtable Conferences. And Gandhi believed that separating untouchables from caste Hindus would have absolved the caste Hindus of their responsibility to eradicate untouchability. What Gandhi was saying and was of the firm belief at the time was that those who actually practice untouchability must abolish untouchability, and that is how he saw untouchables vis-a-vis the caste Hindus. I will not go into the controversy of Gandhi and Ambedkar during the course of my paper, because my focus is mainly on Gandhi and the Roundtable Conferences. I would be reflecting on both the leaders as and when the necessity or the context demands. And before I begin, you have to understand that there is very little focus in the studies available on or very little known fact about Gandhi in the studies available at the on the roundtable conferences, that while he faced the challenge of colonialism and while he tried to tackle the challenge of colonialism in a manner at the round table conferences, he ended up becoming very militant in his attitude. We know the non-violent Gandhi, we know the force of his language, but the manner in which he tackled the whole British paradigm of the roundtable conferences, it changed the tenor of the colonial rule in British India. So the roundtable conferences were a feature of 1930 to 32, when civil disobedience movement was at its full swing, and it had taken the British government by surprise, we are told. And as we all know, Gandhi was spearheading the civil disobedience movement with a very, very strong appeal for attainment of Swaraj or the self-rule. But that was the time when the colonial Britain was also not in a defeatist mood. The colonial state is still very strong in the 1930s. So to diffuse the impact of the civil disobedience movement, the colonial state had organized, we are told, the round table conferences, and to not let go their hold over India. That was also an inherent feature, intrinsic feature of the roundtable conferences. In fact, the contemporary colonials, they actually interpreted the roundtable conferences as peace conferences between Indians and the British, and with some British politicians holding the belief that India needed to move towards dominant status and towards the responsible government, meaning that the Britishers treated the roundtable conferences in the belief that they would make this grant of the dominant status and the responsible government their ultimate goal in granting the eventual independence to India. So the roundtable conferences were actually a series of conferences. There were 3 conferences, and in these conferences, the government decided to nominate Indian delegates in the first roundtable conference, the second roundtable conference, and the third roundtable conference. And this the British did in expectation that their chosen delegates would speak in a manner at the conference that would help not only perpetuate the British rule, but also to further consolidate the British rule. This was in 1930s, when the Britishers still believed that they would continue their rule or as rulers in India forever. That's a belief which is written large in many contemporary British documents. And as the building block for that kind of a belief, they had introduced, or they wanted to introduce, they had already introduced, in fact, and they wanted to consolidate that introduction of separate electorates, particularly in the region of Punjab and Bengal, in favor of the Muslims and in favor of the depressed classes or untouchables throughout India. And when we look deeply, it has been established, and with common knowledge also, we can perceive that the separate electorates were actually an inordinate colonial design to prevent the formation of a united opposition of Indians against the British rule. That was the inherent colonial logic for the process. And that process was rooted in the fact that they wanted the Indians to believe, or they wanted to do away with the suspicions of Indians that they would not grant dominant status to Indians. Alongside, there was an internal argument of the Britishers that the government would make constitution for the future of India, and that the roundtable conferences were a building block in that direction. And what this meant was, and the hint that the Britishers were giving to India at a time when the civil disobedience movement had proved to be a very valiant challenge against the British rule, the impression they were giving, or they were hinting at, was that India was on the path of gaining freedom eventually. So after announcing the Roundtable Conference, the Britishers were hopeful of creating a very affable atmosphere, and so they chose to select what is known as, and what they considered, the most able advocates of the time as delegates, conference delegates, because the Britishers believed and projected, which may not be true. And what they projected was that the most able advocates would come to grips with the serious issues that the colonial government was considering at hand. So the first roundtable conference was held from November 1930 to January 1931. As we all know, it was boycotted by the Indian National Congress of the time, the largest national party of British India at the time, and we know that Gandhi was not part of it. Nevertheless, when the conference was announced, the Britishers were very hopeful, and their newspapers were reporting that, the delegates had promised and assured the British of their cooperation. But as we all know, that the first roundtable conference, since I have to concentrate on the second roundtable conference more, I will switch to that quickly. But the Britishers were hopeful of successful outcome of the first roundtable conference itself. And this can be seen from the hopefulness of the delegates themselves. Muhammad Shafi, a Muslim delegate who was later known to be a separatist Muslim, had declared to the London press, and I quote, that India will come into her own as one of His Majesty's dominion. And the British Prime Minister of the time, Ramsay MacDonald, who was also chairing the roundtable conferences, he echoed the same sentiment, but look at the language he spoke. He said, at the time of the first roundtable conference, that it was a realization of great spirit of nationalism moving India. Of course, the nationalism that he spoke was a British conception of Indian nationalism, in which the colonials visioned themselves continuing permanently their rule in India. But as is well known, the first roundtable conference was adjourned sine die, meaning that it proved abortive. And at the end of the conference, the Britishers claimed that it were the various representatives whom they had chosen as their preferred delegates, and then they claimed that the representatives failed to come to an quote-unquote agreed solution on communal question. Please mark this expression, agreed solution, because this is where Gandhi would counter the British design at the second roundtable conference. And why the agreed solution could not be arrived at the communal question, because the Sikh representatives at the first conference had vehemently opposed granting separate electorates in favor of the Muslims in the Punjab, where they formed a majority, and Sikhs were in a minority. But most importantly, and this is important for us, the depressed classes or the untouchables had issued a disclaimer on the first roundtable conference that they couldn't consent to any self-governing constitution which the British were proposing for India, so long as their demands were not met in a reasonable manner. Their representatives had asked for adult franchise for the untouchables in addition to separate electorates for 10 years to be followed by joint electorates. And Ambedkar, one of the depressed class representatives, along with R. Srinivasan, the two had represented the untouchables at the first roundtable conference, and they would continue to do the same in the second roundtable conference as the nominees or nominated delegates of the Britishers. Ambedkar in particular had seemed very sanguine at the end of the first roundtable conference, because the colonial government had dropped the grant of adult franchise not only in favor of untouchables but for all Indians. And they knew that if they had granted adult franchise, the fate of India, the colony, would have been very, very different. And so for the colonial government, their hopes seem to have dimmed at the end of the first roundtable conference. And the hope was that they were planning to form a contingent of Muslim and the depressed classes opposition against the Indian national movement by separating them from the mainstream movement. And on part of the representatives themselves, they had refused to accept separate electorates as a conditional arrangement because adult suffrage had been refused. And this is what made the first roundtable conference a failure to reach an agreed solution on what the Britishers called the communal question, which made the calling of the second roundtable conference a colonial imperative in the history of India. We all know that the second roundtable conference emerged out of the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, which was signed in 1931 after the British released Gandhi from the prison. And we also know that this was the time when the colonial government had extended an olive branch to the Indian National Congress, the largest national political party of the time in British India. The British had invited the Congress, asking it to participate in the second roundtable conference. And it is also a fact that the Congress had chosen Gandhi as their representative. And Gandhi's leadership, the Congress came to narrow down on Gandhi because his leadership had been or had proven to be an inspiration at all India level during the civil disobedience movement, which, as I already stated, was widely seen as a valiant challenge against the British rule. But there is another angle to this, and it is that Gandhi's selection was no surprise by the Congress, because his image was widely recognized also as that of a unifier. But before departing for London, Gandhi had already put a question mark on the outcome of the first roundtable conference, and he had sent urgent cables to London newspapers in which he had stated, and I quote, if the conference has really offered freedom to India, the reaction should have been felt here. He was referring to the black repression that the colonials were carrying on the Satyagrahis and Indians who were participating in the civil disobedience movement in a very, very rampant manner. But returning delegates from the first roundtable conference were also giving their reactions, which made Gandhi understand the dynamics of the first roundtable conference and perhaps prepared him for the second roundtable conference. There was Sir C.P.R. Iyer from Madras representing the Madras commercial interest. He actually condemned the civil disobedience movement, considering it as the cause of what he said of India's failure at the first roundtable conference. Muslim leaders like Shaukat Ali, who would become as a separatist Muslim later on, in fact targeted Gandhi himself for being against separate electorates that Muslims were demanding. So on their return, Muslim delegates seemed to be in a recalcitrant mood, and I quote, when they targeted Gandhi, and I quote, Shaukat Ali said, if Gandhi wanted civil war, why not test our mettle today? This was a statement of Shaukat Ali, and he would become the die-hard opponent of Gandhi, particularly after his performance at the second roundtable conference. So Muslims were actually holding both Gandhi and Congress responsible for the failure of the first roundtable conference, which they had not even attended. And then we are told that when we look at the depressed class leaders, both Ambedkar and R. Srinivasan appear to be buoyed with hope. The reason being that even though adult suffrage had been dropped as part of their demand, the Britishers had consented to recognize their community as a distinct community vis-a-vis the Hindu majority, meaning agreeing to look at them as a minority within the Hindu majority. And so the depressed classes had also received assurances by the Britishers that their community would be recognized as such, meaning as being distinct in any future constitution of India. But when we look at the untouchable community and how that responded to the returnees of the first roundtable conference delegates, we see mixed response, and this has not been generally highlighted in the studies done on the roundtable conferences clearly. And the mixed response was in a manner in which, while many depressed class associations gave their leaders special recognition, there were some others who raised black flags and even extended criticism. And when it became known that Gandhi would be going to the second roundtable conference, the untouchables once again gave mixed responses. For example, Gandhi had a few depressed classes associations had sent telegrams to Gandhi saying, and I quote, expecting much from you, request you to advocate special privileges through separate electorates. And this was a fact. In fact, when Ambedkar came to know that Gandhi would be representing India at the second roundtable conference, he also expressed his view that Gandhi should see to it that the constitution of which he will be a party will be a thoroughly democratic one. Ambedkar also sought a personal meeting with Gandhi, and when he met Gandhi, Ambedkar had said to Gandhi, and I quote, "I have no homeland, Gandhiji." And he was obviously referring to the bitter ill treatment of untouchables at the hands of caste Hindus in British India. And to this, Gandhi had replied, which is not a very well-known fact. Gandhi's reply was that, of course you have a homeland. You are a patriot of sterling worth. And when Ambedkar asked Gandhi, or told him rather directly by stating, "I'm striving to win human rights for my people, Gandhiji," Gandhi held that political separation of the untouchables from the Hindus would be absolutely suicidal. Please note that the two leaders were speaking from their conscience. But before leaving for London, and this is very little known fact, Gandhi had also met other untouchable leaders like P. Balu, who was a very close friend of Ambedkar and his admirer. And he had also met other community members who were known to view separate electorates as a hindrance in the progress towards nationalism. And we have to understand that before Gandhi was to depart from Bombay, in Bombay itself, untouchables had organized mass meetings and they had passed resolutions, just like the other depressed classes associations who had passed resolutions in favor of separate electorates. There were meetings in which resolutions were passed in support of joint electorates and Mahatma Gandhi, and there were untouchables who were speaking for the Congress. So the second Roundtable Conference convened on 7 September 1931 with 112 delegates, and in this, the larger component was from British India, and representing the interests, just look at the list: Muslims, Sikhs, Anglo-Indians, Indian Christians, princely state representatives, domiciled Europeans, labor, women, commercial interests, and the depressed classes. There were two committees which became very prominent so far as Indians were concerned, and these were the Federal Structure Committee and the Minorities Subcommittee. Of the two, the Federal Structure Committee met first, and the inaugural speech in it by the British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald set the tone of the conference and made it very clear, particularly to Gandhi, what was to expect in the Roundtable Conference. So Ramsay MacDonald announced that the delegates should first devise a system of political representation so that power could be equitably shared, and I'm quoting, between different classes, different communities, and different religious groups before working on the future Constitution of India. Now, this speech made the British prerogative very, very obvious, and it was that he was addressing the Indians in a manner that you first solve the communal problem yourselves, and then we will work on the future constitution. And a very deep study of the proceedings of the conference show that Gandhi became alert to the fact that the leading British policy makers were placing their hopes on the fact that communal problem would last for eternity in India. So when he did not want to play right into the hands of the British, so when his term came to speak in the Federal Structure Committee, he spoke at length and without any hesitation. And when he spoke, he first outlined his mandate, being a representative of the Indian National Congress, and which, and I quote, represents no particular community, no particular class, and no particular interest. Mind you, this is the Congress of pre-British, pre-independence India, not of today's time. So, and he went on to say, like the Congress, he stood for one and indivisible India, and that he would settle for nothing less than complete freedom for India at the conference. He also touched in this speech on separate electorates and was clearly emphatic in saying that these were bad for the Muslims, the Sikhs, and the Hindus, as these divided the nation. But he was equally frank in admitting that the Congress had reconciled itself to special treatment of Hindus, Muslims, and the Sikh tangle, particularly in the Punjab. That means that Congress was ready to make adjustments in terms of separate electorates for the communities. But Gandhi went on to clarify explicitly that the Congress would not agree to extend the doctrine in any shape or form. And he made a bold statement that he himself, as a person, as a leader, or as an Indian, would most strongly resist grant of special representation to other minorities like the Anglo-Indians, the Indian Christians, and the depressed classes. So the federal structure, having made his point clear, the Federal Structure Committee meetings are not elaborated upon in the proceedings of the Roundtable Conference, but then the scenario shifted to the Minority Subcommittee, and there were a total of 4 meetings that had been held, of which the 4th meeting was most conclusive, or rather we can say inconclusive, because the committee itself had to be adjourned sine die, and it was adjourned sine die. But when the minority subcommittee met, in which both Ambedkar and Gandhi were members, along with other delegates, we are told that the members had asked for adjournment, and the members would ask for adjournment a second time also. And they demanded the adjournment, and the demand came from practically all the Indian delegates, barring the depressed classes, because the delegates were in agreement that they wanted informal conversations among themselves to be given a chance for consideration and in the committee. But once the demand was put forward by Madan Mohan Malviya, who was representing Hindu Mahasabha at the conference, it put the untouchable leaders immediately on guard. And the readings of the proceedings indicate that particularly Ambedkar became very, very suspicious that the Congress party through Gandhi may settle with Muslims. So he became very, very apprehensive about the Indian delegates asking for adjournment and not carrying on with official meeting. And he stated his apprehension with full force, and I quote him, "Those who are negotiating informally ought to know that they are not plenipotentiaries at all, and they are not in a position to bind us, which is the untouchables, certainly not. And Ambedkar was immediately supported by the then British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, who was incidentally the chairman of the Minorities Subcommittee. And how he supported Ramsay MacDonald, immediately supported Ambedkar by stating that he had made his position absolutely clear in very splendid manner. The meeting was nevertheless adjourned by him, but not before he made a catty remark about the delegates. And I quote the British Prime Minister as saying, determine, and this is how he addressed the delegates, that the adjournment is not going to be a mere rival fight ending in nothing. But his comment on no, in the second meeting also, delegates asked for adjournment, and this time the adjournment was asked by Gandhi himself, and once more Ambedkar looked for more sureness, and this time Ambedkar was supported by Henry Gidney and Rai Bahadur Paneer Selvan, the representatives of Anglo-Indians and Indian Christians, and they were actually doubting the intentions of Gandhi, and they held the belief that Gandhi would bypass other minorities in any informally agreed solution or in their conversations. So even though Madan Mohan Malviya of Hindu Mahasabha explained that Gandhi might be seeking conciliation of the two communities, which is the Muslims and the Sikhs, to come to an agreed solution, and even though, and note this, Muhammad Shafi he told Ambedkar to shun his misapprehensions, Ambedkar persisted in his demand and said in the committee, quote, I am not to be left out in the cold, mind you. If this internal adjustment is going to be utilized for the purpose of solving Hindu, Muslim, Sikh question only. And it was at this time, we are told, and on this basis, Gail Omveld has spoken about the battle lines being drawn between Ambedkar and Gandhi. But what I want to emphasize is Gandhi's response to the anxiousness of the other minority members. He was not addressing to Ambedkar alone, he was addressing in the committee to all the members. And Gandhi replied that the members were unnecessarily nervous about what is going to happen. He also tried to explain in the committee that he can only act as a humble messenger of peace, and that he would be guilty of sacrificing national interest if he proved unworthy of the trust that Indian people had reposed in him. With factual clarity, he explained to the delegates that their goal is very hazy vis-a-vis the colonial state, and that in his own opinion, that is Gandhi's opinion, that his own opinion carries no greater weight than the opinion of anybody else, meaning that everybody's opinion carried weightage. And then he ended by saying, who am I to deny political status to any single interest or class or even individual in India? And it is for the members to either reject or accept opinions. But in the second meeting also, no agreed solution was reached among the delegates. So the informal meetings had actually failed to bring any conclusive result which the Britishers were too anticipating. When the third meeting convened, Gandhi spoke in a very, very pointedly and clear manner, putting the blame on the British government. And he spoke regarding the composition of the Indian delegates who were not elected representatives of the people of India. Gandhi believed that it was their nomination that precluded all solutions. Secondly, he continued and his speech made it very clear that he doubted that the colonial government was the cushioning factor of the nominated delegates, and that the most delegates looked to the government to tackle the angle. And this is what in the third committee meeting, delegates after delegates would repose their faith in the colonial government. But Gandhi ventured on to suggest, and this time directly to the chairman, Ramsay MacDonald, and he said to him, "You shape the Constitution of India first." And with that, he hit the nail, and he said that communal problem must not be allowed to block the Constitution of India, and which would eventually grant independence to India. And Gandhi also had realized by then that the British would actually use minority quarrels within courts as a reason for postponing the Constitution of India, and with that, obviously, the freedom of India. And the third committee meeting itself, MacDonald began to harp on the themes which Gandhi had anticipated. And so he spoke, Ramsay MacDonald, after Gandhi finished his speech, that from the beginning, and he was egging on to the members, that from the beginning of the conference, we have pressed and pressed and pressed upon you to come to some kind of agreement amongst yourselves. And the British Prime Minister went on to say, we, meaning the government, will find it absolutely impossible to lay down or draft this constitution. And it was then that the Muslims and other small minorities, namely Anglo-Indians, Indian Christians, and domiciled Europeans, including the depressed classes, came together to formulate what other delegates called was a secret pact, and this came to be known as the Minority Pact. And it put forward the demand for separate electorates from the British government in favor of their communities.
Hello. Hello, Dr. Bhavma. We are very close to time. Please try to conclude within 5 to 6 minutes.
Okay. Then I will not go into Minority Pact. The Minority Pact was a little known fact about the conference is that most of the delegates, other than the signatories of the pact, had disapproved of the pact as a final solution to the communal tangle. And I want to come directly to Gandhi. He sat through the proceedings of the last committee very patiently, and spoke at the last when his turn came. He spoke with indomitable will, assertion, and confidence. And he addressed the chairman directly, not the committee member. He dissented from the British Prime Minister that the communal problem hampered the constitution making progress. Second, he also blamed the government for encouraging the communities to press their views differently with full vehemence, and he refused to believe that the government had brought all the delegates thousands of miles away to settle the communal question. And then he spoke on the untouchables on his own behalf. And he said that the question of untouchables in the Minorities Pact was the unkindest cut of all, and that the separate electorates and separate reservations which are demanded would not remove the bar sinister against them, which was actually, he said, a shame of Orthodox Hinduism. But he dissented and spoke, will untouchables remain untouchables in perpetuity? And he expressed his regard for Dr. Ambedkar and even admitted that Ambedkar had labored under bitter experiences, but then he put forward his own viewpoint. I wouldn't bargain away the untouchable rights for the kingdom of the whole world. And he also spoke about the naked truth which the British were trying to do, and it was that separate electorates were to create warring divisions in the villages of India, and that he would resist that with his life. And he ended his speech by pointing to the British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. Those who seek rights of the untouchables don't know their India. And it was this speech which did not draw. In the last meeting, Ambedkar sat silently throughout the meeting, except for informing that he had submitted a separate memorandum to the Minority Pact. And he did not speak at the meeting at all. And in the meeting, no battle lines were drawn between Ambedkar and Gandhi. And Gandhi did not waver from his stand at all, that the Britishers had connived to call the Roundtable Conferences, and that the government, we are told, did not have good intentions. So he asked for adjournment of the committee itself, Sindai, which the chairman did, maybe to assuage the feelings of Gandhi or to assuage Gandhi, because they were unable to crush his point of arguments and were not ready for themselves to abdicate power. And so the Roundtable Conference, second one, was a failure because the Congress was entirely out of it. This is what Gandhi's announcement was. And when he came back, he resumed the civil disobedience movement. And then but the Britishers went on ahead in their design, and they would announce the communal award granting separate electorates in favor of the untouchables, which would then lead to the formation of the Pune Pact between Ambedkar and Gandhi. But that's a different chapter in history. So in all fairness to Gandhi, we have to note that his performance at the round tables was exemplary, and he was able to pierce through the smoke screen that the colonials had created for Indians at the Roundtable Conferences. Thank you very much.
Thanks, ma'am, for putting your insights on Roundtable Conference and how it responded to the question of separate electorate and to the communal question as well. You also chalked out the conflict between Gandhi and Ambedkar on the question of separate electorate, and also the question of human rights of the Dalits as well. Now I will just come to the question and answer session. Dr. Bikram Keshwari Jaina had a question for you. How was what was Gandhi doing at South Africa for a long period of time? His entry in National Congress was mere a strategy of that area, or his dynamic leadership positioned him a great contributor of national movement. Roundtable Conference was an approach of new communication, where he dressed with half dhoti and shal. Historiography always neglected these issues directly. British Raj was hundred doing justice to India, both loot and the development. What your opinion on it?
So, I would like to say that if we have to link South African experience to Gandhi's rise in India, we have to first understand his struggle against the discrimination in terms of civil liberties and racism that he had faced in South Africa. And when he comes to India, he becomes aware of similar developments. B, when he joins the Congress in 1920 with the launch of the non-cooperation movement. Before that, from 1915 onwards, at least for 2 or 3 years up to 1919, we can say, till the Rowlatt Satyagraha, he is on his own. So in order to make his movement a success, he joins the Indian National Congress. And Indian National Congress, because he needs a political body to lead the movement and provide platform to Indians, okay, and against the colonial rule. And what was the second aspect? I didn't get the exact question in the second aspect. The link between South Africa and Congress?
Yes, that question was that what was Gandhi doing at the South Africa for a long period of time? His entry in National Congress was merely a strategy of that area, or his dynamic leadership positioned him a great contributor to the national?
Well, it was his leadership in the regional movements after he came to India that made the Congress look towards him. Champaran, Kheda and Ahmedabad, and then Rowlatt Satyagraha had made Congress aware of Gandhi. And if we look at these local movements and the rising leadership of Gandhi through the local movements, we have to understand that his regionalism, regional rise in the regions or regional problems of India had provided a hinge to the Congress also. So it was a give and take relationship. And what was he doing in South Africa? We all know. Plus one factor that we don't know much about and on which research is being done is that he had done a lot against untouchability in South Africa itself. And that is what would make him his contribution in the Roundtable Conferences, his own contribution in terms of untouchables and Gandhi very, very exemplary, and would bring him into limelight on a completely different platform. So there is a linkage between South African experience and his experience in colonial India. But I don't know if there is a linkage between South Africa and Indian National Congress directly, other than Gokhale, who is in touch with Gandhi as a moderate Congress leader and who became Gandhi's guru. After he comes to India, Gokhale dies, and then he establishes his contact with other Congress leaders, be it in Champaran with Rajendra Prasad or in Gujarat with Sardar Patel. So I feel that he developed his contacts with the Congress slowly, and Congress also developed confidence in him slowly. It's only in 1920, with the launch of the non-cooperation movement, that presidentship of the Congress would be offered to him. So yes, there is a linkage between South Africa and Indian colonialism and the rise of Gandhi, but not necessary in terms of him being a National Congress leader. This is my perception.
Thank you, ma'am, for responding all our questions. Now, I would like to invite Professor Rudran Das to go for a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor Shubham Das. It's my pride, privilege, and pleasure to go for a formal vote of thanks for this session. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Bhagwan Singh Jose, Professor Seema Das, and Professor Archana Burma for enlightening us on our various topics. I extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Vikram Kishori Jena, Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha, and Chinmay Sahu, Executive Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha, for their friendly cooperation to organize this webinar. I would like to express my profound gratitude to our principal, Professor Dr. Pallab Chakrabarty, for his cooperation in organizing the series of webinar. I would like also thank our convener, Professor Sarat Chandra Pradhan, co-convener Professor Shubham Das, and coordinator of Ms. Payal Agarwal and Bhatir Das, tremendous support and guidance to organize this event. Finally, I am happy to express vote of thanks to all the participants, including academics, students, civil society members, politicians, media persons, who have made this webinar a grand success by sparing their precious time with us. Thank you all. Now the meeting is concluded. The message for the participants: the feedback link of e-certificate will be provided in our 100th session at 10th December 2020, 11 a.m. Thank you all. Have a good day.